Hi everyone. So today we are going to be talking about thinking and judgment. There's a lot that becomes involved in this topic, such as our own personal biases and societal biases, and also something called heuristics, which we're going to talk about today. So all of these things affect our judgment. So these are the topics that will be covered in this lecture. So how we make judgments, what kinds of heuristics and biases affect our judgments, and what factors make us better at making judgments. So throughout this entire course, you've learned a lot about different types of knowledge. You've learned about the knowledge of language, you've learned about the knowledge of concepts and theories and memory and how our knowledge is retained. You've learned about our visual knowledge and visual representation. And so today we're going to be talking a little bit about what we do with knowledge, how we use that knowledge to help us figure things out, judge things, problem solve. Um, so the rest of this course is going to look at the things we do to use knowledge and how we take the things that we've learned and make decisions. So how do we use those representations of the world that we have developed over time to make decisions? So sometimes when we're making judgments and using our knowledge to make a decision, we use something called inductive reasoning. So the basis of inductive reasoning is that we are taking specific facts and narrowing them down to a general conclusion. Um, so this takes a lot of our past knowledge and experience because generally we're going to take um, things that we've experienced and information we have from our experience and make a decision based on that. However, sometimes when we are using induction, um, we can distort and make illogical conclusions because of things called heuristics. So, generally speaking, there's this idea that there are flaws at times with our judgment. Sometimes we make judgments that are not accurate. There are people that believe in things um, that are probably not in existence, like things like telepathy. We might make judgments and have feelings about different situations and circumstances that lead us to be prejudiced or racist or um, make poor decisions about what to do in society. And so sometimes our judgment is not the best. Um, However, sometimes our judgment is amazing and we're able to make incredible decisions and do incredible things because of our possibilities, our abilities as humans. Um, so one thing that comes up here when we're talking about judgment is the idea that we have two distinct ways of thinking, and depending on which type of thinking we use, can depend upon the how good our judgment is in that circumstance. It's not always fail-safe. So sometimes if we use system one for making a decision, it doesn't necessarily mean that our judgment is going to be flawed there. But system one thinking or type one thinking is more quick and easy. And a lot of times, one of the things we're going to be talking about involving heuristics falls into this category. The other type of thinking, type two or system two, is slower and takes more effort. And it's usually a lot more accurate than type 1 thinking. When people use this type of thinking, they have less likelihood of making heuristic based errors. So it's thought that sometimes people use type 1 thinking when they don't have to make a judgment that matters, and type 2 is used more for more important judgments. People tend to rely on type 1's heuristics even if they're trying to be accurate, however. And in some cases, type 1 error can be deadly and cause a lot of problems because people make a quick decision and it's really not the best, and really they should have been using type 2. Um, so, why do we use type 1 thinking? There could be reasons like we have time pressure or we're not focusing correctly on what we're doing. But sometimes it's true that when we make type 1 judgments, we can actually be making the best type of judgments. It could be more sophisticated. So, for example, in one study, firefighters anticipating how flames would spread through a building or judging the risk of the building collapsing show that the study showed that firefighters have to make judgments really fast, take less effort, and are very accurate. Firefighters don't know how they've made that judgment. They say they just know, and that helps them make that judgment. There's also studies involving nurses who are able to look at patients and detect something life threatening almost immediately. And once again, it's one of those feelings of just knowing. So, we're going to talk a little bit more about heuristics and how we use heuristics. So, it's important to note that heuristics are efficient, they are usually quick, and they help us make a decision more quickly based on our past experience, but sometimes can lead to mistakes. So Dr. Starling included this slide on what it means to make mistakes. I'm going to actually jump right into heuristics and start talking about those. But the idea is that a normative is the ideal thing that we can compare our result to when we're trying to make a decision. So we're going to talk a little bit about heuristics. Decisions that we make are often based upon heuristics. We're going to go into a little bit of detail that looks at how we end up using heuristics when we're making a judgment. Generally speaking, heuristics are strategies we use to reason. They tend to help us reason quickly and efficiently, but sometimes, even because they're so quick and efficient, they lead to error. So sometimes there's a trade-off between accuracy and speed. So maybe we're able to make that decision or judgment quickly, but it's not the right decision or judgment because we did it too quickly. I'm assuming that these two guys on the slides are famous people, but I'm not quite sure who they are. I'm thinking maybe Tversky and Kahneman, but I am not certain. Dr. Starling made these slides, so they look like two pretty groovy dudes. So enjoy their pictures. So often when we're trying to make a judgment, we're going to rely on frequencies. So for example, if you are trying to shop for the best TV on Black Friday, which just happened, you're going to want to know which TVs tend to last the longest, which ones have the best picture, which ones tend not to break as quickly, things like that. Um, so in that case, you're going to use frequencies to make a judgment. You're going to do your research, hopefully. Some other estimates of frequency. Are there a lot of Chinese restaurants in Center Valley? I live in Coopersburg, and honestly, I only know of one Chinese restaurant that we will order from, which is over by the I guess it's by the Weiss. Um, so yeah, I don't really think there are a lot of Chinese restaurants in Center Valley, but you sit there and you're like, okay, how many restaurants can I order from? How likely are you to get H1N1 or some other disease? Estimates of frequency. There's the question of determining cause and effect. How does the weather influence your mood? Well, today, as I'm recording these slides, um, it's pouring outside. It's pretty gross. I really just want to go home and watch Netflix, and I feel kind of grumpy. So, in this case, the weather is influencing my mood. But generally speaking, doing an estimate of how often the weather has influenced my mood is pretty hard. You can't always determine the cause and the effect there. I will say generally that I think I've said generally speaking like 75 times on this slide, so I apologize. Once again, recording these lectures has been one of the most painful experiences in my life, and so I apologize if it seems that way. Um, but it can really be difficult to do a frequency estimation because you don't always have all the information in front of you, or you only have awareness of certain components of information and not others. So what do we do when we can't accurately estimate frequency because we just don't have all the information we need in our brain? We use heuristics. So we use the availability heuristic. We often use availability as a substitution for frequency. It's specifically called attribute substitution, and this is a strategy in which you're relying on information to easily assessed information to use as a proxy for information you really need. So I'm not certain about how many Chinese restaurants are around in Center Valley, but I do know of that one in Coopersburg. And, that's the only information I have available to me. So I might make a heuristic and say there's only one available restaurant in Coopersburg. But is that 100% true? I don't know. So we often use this availability heuristic as a substitute. It usually, when we say availability heuristic, we're discussing how quickly something comes to mind. Um, so it's something that we can do quickly, and it's something that's easy, and it's often not something that takes us a long time. So, for an example, I want everybody right now to try to figure out if there are more words that start with R in our language or words that have R in the middle of them. Go. So you might have thought there are more words that start with R, when honestly there are actually more words that have R in the that have R in the middle of them in the third position. So most people will state that there are more words beginning with R, but that's not true. But when you think about it, you're more likely to say um, that words start with R because when you search your memory, um, many words are going to come to mind that start with R. But if you search your memory for words with R in the third position or in the middle of the word, fewer are going to emerge. So this difference is because your memory is organized kind of like a dictionary, and words that start with the same sound are all grouped together. So consequently, it's easier to find a memory start with a starting letter instead of a middle letter. Um, so that organization of your memory in turn creates a bias or a heuristic. So as you can see, there are often errors that can occur when we use availability. Sometimes it's a good estimate of our frequency, but if if we don't have equalness in availability and frequency, it can lead to errors. So with that example of using the first letter of a word versus the middle letter of a word, we just don't have availability in our brain to how frequent that event occurs. Um, so there are a lot of different situations where we end up making judgments of importance, and we use the availability heuristic, and we're incorrect. Um, so there's the study that Tversky and Kahneman did that I was just talking about. They looked at how many people would say that there are more words beginning with T versus words with T in the third position. So here's another example of how we tend to make errors. In one study, participants were asked to think about episodes in their lives in which they'd acted assertively. Half of the participants were asked to recall 6 of these episodes, and half were asked to recall 12. Then all participants were asked general questions, including how assertive overall they thought they were. Participants in the study had an easy time coming up with 6 episodes, and so using the availability heuristic, they concluded that those cases came quickly to mind, therefore, there must be a large number of these episodes. I must be an assertive person. In contrast, participants who were asked for 12 episodes had more difficulty generating a longer list, and they concluded that if these cases are so difficult to recall, I guess the episodes can't be typical for how I act. Consistent with these suggestions, participants were asked to recall fewer episodes, judged themselves to be more assertive. So this is interesting because those who tried to recall more episodes actually ended up with more evidence in view um, for their own assertiveness, but it wasn't the quantity that mattered. It was the ease that it took to come up with the episodes. So those who were asked for a dozen episodes had a harder time because it was more difficult. It was harder for them to access the information. It was harder for them to bring it into their knowledge. Same as with the letter errors. It's easier to bring into your short-term memory how many letters begin with a T or an R or an F or whatever the case may be versus how many of them have those letters in the third position of a word. So people tend to regularly do this overestimation of the frequency of events. In fact, sometimes we do this with events that are actually pretty rare. Um, Things like buying lottery tickets with the idea that you might win, or worrying about getting on a plane because there's that chance it might crash, when there have been rare amounts of plane crashes. And Sometimes even physicians overestimate the likelihood of a rare disease, and in that process, they fail to pursue other more appropriate diagnoses. So, in that example, that could actually be a major issue for somebody, a major health issue, and these doctors are using the availability error. So, why do we do this? Well, honestly, one of the reasons we do this is as humans, we're more likely to think about things that are rare. We pay more attention to things that are rare. We encode things that are more rare to us, especially if they involve some sort of emotion. I'm not sure if Dr. Starling, when she was talking about memory, talked about flashbulb memories, but think about how easy it is to recall um, major life events that were overly emotional or traumatic. It's much more available in our memory than maybe thinking about like when you lost your first tooth and everything that went along with that situation. Although that probably wasn't the best example, but you get the point. So we're more likely to think about things that have happened, like, oh, we heard about this giant airplane crash and it was really tragic and horrible. And when we think about getting on a plane, our brain might jump to that, especially if we're anxious about flying in planes. So we often rely on the availability heuristic. We often overestimate the frequency of distinctive events, even when it's not accurate. And we often overestimate the likelihood of similar things happening in the future. Another bias we have involves extrapolation. Sometimes, even though we only have a limited amount of availability to ourselves, or just a little bit of information that we can use, we decide and make a judgment based upon that single case or that one little bit of information. So we infer properties that belong to everybody in that category because of just this limited bit of information. So, for example, back to the TV example I gave you earlier. You are wandering around Target on Black Friday and you see all of these different TVs that are on sale. One of which is like a 52-inch TV for like $50. And I know that would never happen. But anyway, so you look at this TV and it's um, Blumco brand television. And you're like, wow, this Blumco brand TV is only $50 and it's a 52-inch TV. That's absolutely fantastic. And so you're thinking about buying it, but you've never heard of Blumco before. Um, so you do like a web search on your phone. You pull your phone out and you're looking and you're seeing that Blumco reviews are pretty decent. You look it up, you see that magazines say that Blumco is great and you should buy their televisions. The picture's clear. It's great for watching sports. It's great for watching Netflix, whatever the case may be. Blumco is awesome. So you get your Blumco TV and you put it in your cart and you're walking down the aisle ready to check out and all excited about this amazing Black Friday purchase that you've discovered. And you see your friend Frederico over down another aisle. And you're like, hey, Frederico. And he has a bunch of things in his cart that he's getting for Black Friday, and he looks in your cart and he goes, "Oh no, you're buying a Blumco?" And you go, "Well, yeah, it's $50 and everything seems to be great about a Blumco." And he's like, "You must be insane. You don't want to buy a Blumco." I knew somebody who had a Blumco, and like a week after buying it, the screen just cracked and it didn't work anymore, and there was fire coming out of it, and it was really, really terrible. And just, oh, Blumco, you can't get a Blumco. How could you possibly do that? So, because you know Frederico, um, you look into that argument and you would take your friend's data because you would see that somebody that you know has this persuasive argument, and you might actually extrapolate that this one case is the way these all of these TVs are, and maybe that those reviews were actually incorrect. So obviously, using this little bit of information to make a judgment is probably not the best. That Blumco TV could be fantastic, but sometimes what we do is we infer a property of a category based on an individual member. That one Blumco TV was terrible. Another example is all houses who have windows because your house has windows. That must mean that all houses have windows. Um, so sometimes we make heuristics based on, we use a heuristic based on this. And as I am recording this slide, I believe I may have accidentally said at some point that this was the availability heuristic. This is actually our next heuristic that we're going to discuss, the representativeness heuristic. So involving extrapolation, that fits under the representativeness heuristic, not the availability heuristic. So I apologize for that error and that confusion. So go and change in your notes if you're taking notes as you're listening to me talk about Blumco TVs. Go ahead and go and change that in your notes. And I'm so sorry for the error. Sometimes as I'm recording, I realize that I'm going and going with the information. I think I might have said the wrong thing, but I don't want to go back and re-record the whole slide. So you're looking at the availability heuristic here. I'm sorry. See, I did it again. The representativeness heuristic. For slide 14, we are talking about the representativeness heuristic. I am so sorry. So moving on to talk more about the representative heuristic. This is when we assume homogeny and we believe that all members in a category are homogeneous. So because one Blumco TV is bad, all Blumco TVs are bad. Because one member of a category represents that category, that must be the way all of them are. So I guess what Dr. Starling was getting at with this picture, there's a whole bunch of famous psychologists at the bottom of this slide. So the idea is if you've seen one psych professor, then you've seen them all. Now we know that this obviously isn't accurate. For example, you've seen all the different psychology professors probably at this point at DeSales. Dr. Hublon, Dr. Ramsland, Dr. Starling, and Dr. Null are all totally different people. They are not exactly the same in their teaching styles. They're not exactly the same in the types of things that they like to teach. They're all different. But you might make a judgment if you take one psychology class and you don't like it, that if you've taken one psychology class, you've taken all psychology classes, and there's no point in taking more if you didn't like it. So we tend to assume that one representative member of that category means that all of those things are going to be the same. You could apply this to almost anything. You go to a restaurant and somebody goes, "Hey, try this tomato. It's an amazing tomato, and you've never had a tomato before." And you would take a bite out of that tomato, and it is disgusting, and you hate it. And so then you make the assumption, I don't like tomatoes. So that's the representativeness heuristic. So part of this here, using the representativeness heuristic, there are certain things called fallacies that sometimes gets involved. So I want you to imagine that you're given a coin and you're asked to do a coin toss, and you're going to toss that coin 6 times, and let's say the coin has landed heads up 6 times in a row. So most people will believe that the next toss of the coin is more likely to come up tails, but this is a gambler's fallacy, and it's wrong. So the logic leading up to this fallacy seems to be that if the coin is fair, then a series of tosses should contain equal numbers of heads and tails. So it should be 50-50. But obviously that's not true. Just because a coin lands on heads 6 times does not necessarily mean that it's going to now end on tails. It doesn't have any feelings or emotions. It's just a coin. It doesn't actually have capability of fairness, but that's just what our perspective tends to be. So why does this happen? So our brain just believes that there should be that the coin toss should be homogeneous, that there should be fairness when the coin is tossed, that it's overdue for there to be some sort of balance, that it's been 6 times on heads, so now it's its turn to be on tails. But of course, a coin has no memory. It does not know the concept of fairness. It's not influenced by how long it's been since the coin flipped to the other side, and therefore there is the likelihood of a tail occurring on any toss is independent of what happened on previous tosses. There's no way that the previous tosses influence next one. So there's this idea that there should be fairness, but we all know in our brains in the long run that a fair coin will produce equal numbers of heads and tails. So thus the category of all tosses has this property. But then our assumption of homogeneity leads us to believe and leads us to the representativeness that there is always going to be a 50-50 split. but there's no likelihood of a 50-50 split. There's no reason there should be a 50-50 split. If we flip the coin 100 times, there might not be a 50-50 split. There could be a 90%, 10% split. It's only when we combine sequences. Sorry, my computer just went to sleep. It's only when we combine sequences that the 50-50 split emerges. So what I'm trying to say is that our brain just believes that there should be a 50-50 split. This is what is fair. But the likelihood of that actually happening is very rare. However, sample size matters. The more coins we have, the more likely the sequence will reflect the actual population. So there's a chance that if you flip more coins several times, there's a bigger chance that there will be a 50-50 split. If you have fewer cases, you're more likely to see a deviation from what is expected. So in general, the representativeness heuristic is this idea that there will be homogeneity, and that it's all or everything is this. It's either all or nothing. All professors are the same. All psych professors are the same. All Blumco TVs are the same. We just make these general assumptions based on that little bit of knowledge that we have. So this is a study by Kahneman and Tversky. There are 2 hospitals. In the larger hospital, 45 babies are born each day, and in the smaller one, 15 babies. As you know, about 50% of babies are boys, but the exact percentage varies from day to day. Sometimes it may be higher than 50, sometimes lower. For a period of a year, each hospital recorded the days on which more than 60% of the babies were boys. Which hospital do you think recorded more such days? So in most cases, if this was done during a formal research study, people would answer that both hospitals were equal and there was a 50-50 split. But this answer is statistically unwarranted, that there would be a 50-50 split. If all the births in the country add up to a 50-50 split between male and female births, and the larger the sample you examine, the more likely you are to approximate this ideal. But the smaller the sample you examine, the more likely you are to stray from this ideal. Days with 60% male births straying from the ideal are therefore more likely in the smaller hospital, Hospital B. So the answer would be that Hospital B recorded more such days. But unfortunately, people tend not to think that. They think that it's going to be 50-50. This is, once again, the representativeness heuristic. On another note, those baby pictures that Dr. Starling picked for this slide are incredibly terrifying, and I think they're going to haunt my dreams forever. So continuing with errors from the representativeness heuristic, one of the major things that can happen from using this heuristic is stereotyping. So that assumption of homogeneity allows us to generalize based on a very small number of observations that everybody in that category is the same. So if you've seen one psych professor, you've seen them all. Think right now about some of the other stereotypes you might have heard about people's cultures, or about particular career paths. I'll give you one. My husband is an architect, and he knows a lot of engineers, and there's an assumption that all engineers are weird. However, I've met lots of not weird engineers, but that's a common stereotype. All psych professors are nerdy. Once again, that's a stereotype. We're all pretty cool, actually, if you get to know us. Once again, that's a stereotype. So we do this even when we're told in that instance that it's not representative. So even if we're told, no, 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 they don't fit that stereotype. No, 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 they're different. Sometimes we still make that judgment call. Another example would be the idea of things like all pit bulls are mean dogs. But I know a lot of people who have some awesome pit bulls as pets, and they're not always mean dogs. Some pit bulls may be mean. Some chihuahuas are terrible. But we can't just stereotype and make a judgment based upon only having one or a few pieces of information about that one particular person or individual in that category. So I've already talked a little bit about the expectation that an entire category is going to have the same properties as individual category members. In a study by Hamill, Wilson, and Nesbitt in 1980, individuals saw video clips of a prison guard. Half of the prison guards were said to be compassionate, half were said to be mean and extreme. Um, Before seeing this video, some participants were told that the guard was typical for those at the prison, and other participants were told that he was atypical for the prison. Participants were later questioned about their views of the criminal justice system and were plainly influenced by the interview they saw. Those who saw the compassionate guard indicated that they believed prison guards in general were decent people, and those who had seen the extremist guard reported more negative views of guards. What's remarkable about this is that participants seemed to ignore information about whether the interviewed guard was typical or atypical. So that didn't really seem to matter. Those who were told that the guard was atypical were just as influenced by the interview as those who were told that the guard was typical. Those who saw a mean guard reported more negative views, and this really didn't matter whether or not they were told the guard was typical or atypical. So here's another one looking at representativeness era. Linda is a 31-year-old single, outspoken, and bright person. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with the issues of discrimination and social justice and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations. Which is more probable about Linda? 1. Linda is a bank teller, or 2. Linda is a bank teller that is active in the feminist movement. She's a bank teller active in the feminist movement. So what is your response? A lot of times in this study, when people are looking at this question, majority of the participants, about 85% sometimes, chose option B. Logically, it makes no sense. There's no way for option B to be true without option A also being true. So there's no reason that option B would be more likely than option B. And choosing option B is the same as if we randomly chose someone who lives in our country and saying that the chance of that person being from Vermont is greater than them being from anywhere else just because they live in the United States. So sometimes we make associations based upon information we're given that really make absolutely no sense. Why do people choose option B so much? This option makes sense if people are relying on representativeness again. So they make a category judgment by saying, well, how much does Linda resemble my idea of a bank teller? And how much does she resemble my idea of a feminist bank teller? On this basis, this could easily be led to option B because the description of Linda does in fact encourage a view of her and her politics. The other possibility is that with options A and B sitting side by side, somebody might say, well, if option A is talking about a bank teller who is a feminist, or I mean, if option B is talking about a bank teller who is a feminist, then option A must be talking about a bank teller who is not feminist. On that interpretation, choosing option B does seem reasonable. Is that how you interpreted option A, or did you interpret it differently? How did you answer? So, some other evidence. If you sit in the duck one day, you might hear conversations where we hear something unusual and assume it to be overrepresentative and make judgments. All over the place we hear these types of conversations. I know a man who, or I knew this girl who, and we tend to be persuaded by these arguments. That's the representativeness heuristic. And it also involves how willing you are to extrapolate from a small sample of only knowing one person. So, for example, I knew a man who smoked all of his life and he lived to be 110. Or I know somebody who bought a Kia and it fell apart within 6 months. Or back to the Blumco TVs. My buddy bought a Blumco and it exploded. So there you go with representativeness. So what do we do when we don't know the answer to the question? We tend to go towards that idea of estimation based on our idea of what the ballpark answer is. The ballpark is also known as the anchor. We adjust this anchor to reach our final answer, but a lot of the time when we're making an estimate and we try to adjust the anchor, we don't adjust it enough. So this anchoring effect is shown in one study that was done by Strack and Musweiler in 1997. And in this study, participants were asked whether Gandhi lived how long he lived. Group 1 was asked, did he live past the age of 140? And Group 2 was asked, was he older than the age of 9 when he died? So honestly, it's kind of obvious that if you know who Gandhi is, you know that he had to have lived past the age of 9, and you know that it would be impossible for him to live past the age of 140. So you could safely guess that Gandhi was older than 9 and younger than 140. But things got a little weird here because the group that was prompted with the younger age guessed that on average Gandhi was 50 when he died, and the group that was prompted with the older age guessed 67. Neither's actually close. Gandhi was 87 years old when he died, and he was assassinated. So who knows how much longer he would have lived if that hadn't happened. But the point proves not that people are ignorant about history of different important individuals in history, but it proves that arbitrary numbers, even when we know them to be completely unreasonable, tend to lead to an anchoring effect, and it drags our judgment in the direction of the first impression we received. So those who thought that he might not have lived past 9 were dragged to a lower age, whereas those who were given the age of 140 were dragged to a higher age. So this is the interesting thing is the anchoring event. Oh, I should have gone through all these builds. The initial anchor influences our estimation. Um, so another thing that we can think of when we're thinking of anchoring, it's not just numerical, but the initial anchor can also be seen as our first impression. So think about it. When you've met a person for the first time, how often does that impression that you got of them that first time you met them stick with you in the long term? It tends to. Once we've made a judgment about somebody, we tend to continue having some component of that judgment for the length of time we know them, even if as we find out more information about them, um, we can shift that judgment. That's still a part of our perception of them. So Dr. Starling has a few more slides in here about the availability heuristic, the representative heuristic, and the anchoring and adjustment heuristic. I'm going to skip these slides. Sometimes she goes a little bit more into detail than I tend to do in this section of the course. So bear with me for a minute. So sometimes errors are made in judgment um, because of heuristics, and sometimes these errors in judgment are about something called covariation. So these covariation is essentially when two things tend to go together, they covary with each other. So for example, people who exercise regularly tend to have better stamina. So working, it's the idea that you're seeing a relationship between two things. Sometimes, however, people make errors that are what we call illusions of covariation. So sometimes people detect covariation even when there is none. For example, so sorry, I had to pause for a second. So I know there's going to be a little bit of a it's going to be a little choppy there where I say, for example. So I'm going to give you some examples now involving covariation. So things like the relationship between being a Leo and being brave. Or a Virgo and whatever a Virgo is supposed to be. So people see a relationship between their astrological sign and their personality, which there's really no link there. Or things like superstitions are illusions of covariation, like the idea that Friday the 13th is automatically going to be a bad day because 13 is an unlucky number. We could go on. Some people even believe that things covary with lying. Like if you're looking around a lot when you're talking and not looking somebody in the eye, you must be lying. But the evidence suggests otherwise. So unfortunately, I'm not sure where Dr. Starling gets some of the research that she has put in this presentation, because some of the things that she has in here are things that are not in your text, and they're not in any of the research that I have. But in 1992, it was thought that Chanteau found that despite extensive experience, professionals are not immune to illusions of covariation. Um, this happens all the time where people do studies and they have a covariation that shows up or a correlation, and they believe that that automatically means that one thing is related to the other, and it's not just the data. So there's been a whole bunch of different studies that have come out that you sometimes will hear in the news, and they're like, antidepressants are linked to suicide, and autism is linked to vaccines, and that there's this relationship here when that relationship might not be 100% valid. Um, I'm not sure exactly what Shanto's study looked at because I don't have the evidence in the chapters in their textbook, and it's doesn't seem to be in this chapter that I'm talking about. And Chapman in 1971, while they're also cited throughout the materials for this course, I don't have the particular study that's involving 1971. I do know that they did a lot of research on things like superstition, so I'm assuming that that's where Dr. Starling was going. So honestly, you don't have to worry about this slide when it comes to being tested because I'm not going to put anything on the test about something that I'm not sure about. So we do know that when somebody is judging covariation, that we typically use evidence that's guided by something called confirmation bias. So basically, you have a tendency to be more responsive to evidence that confirms beliefs that you've already had, rather than to evidence that might challenge your beliefs. So, for example, if you've always believed that um, if you've always believed, I'll use the example here, that big dogs are mean, you'll notice that there are more mean big dogs. That doesn't mean that more big dogs are mean. That's just confirming the relationship that you have already believed exist. So if you're asked to estimate covariation between dog size and temperament, you're probably going to overestimate that covariation. It's not because you're ignoring facts, and it's not because you're incompetent. It's just that your data is based on your history, and so that's your judgment. Oops. So another issue that can happen is that we neglect base rate information that we're given, and that's information about how frequently something occurs in general. So to give you an example, let's imagine that we're testing a new drug in the hope that's going to cure the common cold. We're trying to find out if the drug covaries with a better medical outcome, and let's say that 70% of the patients taking the drug do recover from the illness within 48 hours. This result is not able to be interpreted on its own because we need the base rate. We need to know how often, in general, people recover from their colds in the same time span. If it turns out that the overall rate within 48 hours is 70%, then our new drug has no effect. Some other things that you can look at that where we neglect base rates is things like Lucky Charms. Not the cereal, even though the cereal is fantastic with those little mini marshmallows, but like Lucky Charms that people carry around and say are helpful, like a rabbit's foot or wearing a particular shirt for a football game, or whatever, a lucky jersey or lucky socks, whatever you want, whatever you have as your good luck charm. Um, let's let's look at an example for that. So let's say that you wear your lucky socks whenever your favorite team plays and the team has won 85% of its games. And we need to ask about base rates. So how many games has your team won over the last few years? If your team has won more than 85% or 85% and greater overall, your socks really mean nothing. They are a jinx. So really, you're thinking that your socks mean something when they're just socks. Um, Now I kind of want some Lucky Charms though. So generally speaking, you need to have the information that you're looking at as far as what category you're trying to figure out. Um, Information that indicates you're in one category versus another, lucky versus unlucky, and you need to have the base rate, so the likelihood that the case is going to be in one category versus another. Um, So in 1973, Kahneman versus Tversky, and Tversky, not versus Tversky, I saw lawyer and my brain said versus. Kahneman and Tversky looked at how likely is a person to be an engineer or a lawyer. So they gave participants base rate information in group 1, 70 lawyers, 30 engineers, diagnostic information in group 2, personality profiles, and group 3 got both types of information. Group 3 ignored the base rate information. They didn't pay attention to whether or not they were 70 lawyers or whether or not the person was a lawyer or an engineer. They just looked at their personality profile. So, when group 3 was provided with both types of information, they relied only on the descriptive information about the individual. They responded in the same way if the base rates were already described. 70 lawyers or 30 engineers, or if the base rates were reversed, 30 lawyers and 70 engineers. The reversal had no impact on judgment, and this confirmed that they were ignoring the base rates. They didn't look at them at all. They just looked at the diagnostic information, the descriptions they were given. So it's not all bad. We can rise above heuristics. Sometimes we're able to do so, but other times we still have difficulty and we just use them. They're quick and easy. Sometimes they're effective. Sometimes they lead to pretty major errors. Here's another question. How many sumo wrestlers are there in the NEPA? I don't even know what the NEPA is. But anyway, awareness of a lack of knowledge leads to use of information other than its simple availability. So for me, I wouldn't just make a guess here. I would have to go look up what the NEPA is. So you guys can go and do that on your own. We can also overcome representativeness. So the next few slides, I'm going to just go through them so you can see them. But the remaining slides in this lecture are all about System 1 versus System 2 and that the dual processing, or not dual processing, sorry, I'm going back in my notes. Yeah, dual process models. I was right. So it's all about dual processing. I feel like I already talked about that to the extent that I want to. So I'm gonna page through the slides, but I don't really necessarily want to go over them again. Of course, if you're interested in this a little bit more, you can go ahead and read about it in the book. So there talks about some studies that were done looking at System 1 and System 2. So remember, System 1 is when we do things more quickly, and System 2 is when we slow ourselves down, and you need training to do System 2. And so that's all about heuristics versus reason, System 1 versus System 2. And just as a summary, we know that statistical principles can often tell us how to make good inferences, but our judgment is often subject to other biases and errors. So even if we have the ability to gain information statistically or to look it up, a lot of the time we take the easy way out and we do the quick and dirty method of using a heuristic. Heuristics govern most of our inferences. We have the availability heuristic, representativeness heuristic, anchoring and adjustment, and we also often forget to take important info into account, which leads to things like illusory covariation, using the confirmation bias, and base rate neglect. However, if we're given the appropriate things, the appropriate cues and circumstances and training, we tend to make more accurate judgments. So that's it for this section of the slides. I noticed that this book chapter talked a little bit about logic and problem solving. I'm assuming that's in the last section of slides, which I'm going to work on recording this week, and I will post them as well. So this is the second to last grouping of slides for this course. I'm looking forward to seeing you guys all in class on Thursday for presentations, or if it's already Thursday or after Thursday, hi. It was nice seeing you in class. And I think that's it for now. So I hope that this wasn't too dry. I also am doing Dr. Starling's human development stuff, and it's much more interesting to go through and record that, and I can make more jokes. So I feel like, with this stuff, it's pretty dry lecture material. So hopefully you enjoyed some of my jokes about the people in the slides and things like that. So I'm going to go eat some Lucky Charms now. Not really. And I hope that everybody's doing great. Thanks.